When a research team stumbled upon reports of massive human remains unearthed in Montana's Beartooth Mountains in 1889, they expected to find exaggerated folklore. What they discovered instead was a carefully documented case that vanished from the historical record so completely, it's as if someone wanted it erased. The evidence wasn't just buried, it was systematically destroyed. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The story begins with a seemingly routine excavation near the town of Maiden, Montana. Local miners digging foundation trenches for a new stamp mill struck something that stopped work immediately. According to the Maiden Mineral newspaper dated November 14, 1889, the workers uncovered skeletal remains of extraordinary size and unusual conformation. But here's where it gets strange. The newspaper described skulls measuring twice the circumference of normal adult specimens, and femur bones suggesting individuals standing between 9 and 11 feet tall. The same article mentioned that a Professor Thomas Wilson from the Smithsonian Institution was contacted about the discovery. Within 3 weeks, according to subsequent reports, a team arrived from Washington to examine and collect the remains. Photographs were allegedly taken. Measurements were recorded. Wooden crates were constructed on-site to transport the specimens. And then, silence. No follow-up articles, no academic papers, no museum exhibitions. The evidence simply disappeared into institutional custody, never to be seen again. But Montana wasn't alone. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Just 7 months earlier, in April 1889, the Arizona Gazette reported the discovery of enormous skeletal remains in a cave system near the Grand Canyon. The article described gigantic proportions and mentioned Smithsonian involvement. Then the trail goes cold. In 1883, the New York Times covered the excavation of massive burial mounds in West Virginia, containing remains of individuals much larger than men of today. Smithsonian scientists supervised the dig. The artifacts vanished. In 1891, according to the Crittenden record in Marion, Kentucky, laborers uncovered a skeleton measuring over 8 feet with peculiar proportions while clearing land. Academic authorities were notified. No subsequent documentation exists. The Montana case stands out because of its documentation density. Multiple witnesses signed affidavits. A local physician, Dr. Samuel Hendricks, conducted preliminary examinations and noted anatomical proportions inconsistent with known human variation. His handwritten notes, discovered in a Billings archive in 1994, describe cranial capacities approximately 40% larger than modern averages and skeletal robustness suggesting beings adapted for extraordinary physical demands. Here's what makes the Montana evidence particularly compelling: the geological context. The remains were discovered in sediment layers containing mastodon bones and other Pleistocene fauna. If the stratigraphic association is accurate, these remains could date to periods when conventional archaeology insists anatomically modern humans didn't exist in North America. The silence around this chronological impossibility is deafening. Before we go further, if you're starting to question why this information isn't in textbooks, you're not alone. This channel investigates the evidence that doesn't fit official narratives. Subscribe now, because what comes next reveals a pattern so consistent it demands explanation. The Smithsonian Institution's role appears repeatedly in these vanished cases. Founded in 1846, the Smithsonian positioned itself as America's primary archaeological authority during the exact period when these giant skeleton discoveries peaked. roughly 1880 to 1920. According to newspaper archives, the institution was involved in collecting, examining, or securing anomalous skeletal remains in at least 17 documented cases between 1885 and 1912. What happened to these specimens? Official Smithsonian records show no inventory entries for giant human remains from Montana, Arizona, Kentucky, Ohio, Wisconsin, or any of the other frequently cited discovery locations. When researchers file Freedom of Information Act requests, they receive responses claiming no such materials exist in the collections. Either the newspapers fabricated dozens of detailed reports across multiple decades, or someone made a systematic decision to eliminate evidence. The Montana case provides a clue. According to a 1924 letter discovered in the Montana Historical Society archives, a former Smithsonian curator named William Henry Holmes wrote to a colleague about problematic specimens that contradicted established timelines of human development. Holmes explicitly referenced the need to maintain scientific credibility by excluding finds that introduce unnecessary confusion. The letter never mentions Montana specifically, but the timing aligns perfectly with the period when these giant skeleton reports ceased appearing in newspapers. But here's where it gets strange. The cessation wasn't gradual, it was abrupt. Between 1890 and 1912, newspapers across America published hundreds of articles about giant skeleton discoveries. Then, starting around 1913, the coverage drops to nearly nothing. What changed? The American Anthropological Association formalized its standards for acceptable evidence. Academic journals established peer review protocols that excluded amateur discoveries, and institutional archaeology consolidated control over what qualified as legitimate findings. The Montana specimens represent something specific, evidence that doesn't fit the approved narrative of human origins and migration. If 9 to 11-foot humans coexisted with Pleistocene megafauna in North America, it demolishes the Bering Strait migration theory. It challenges the timeline of human evolution. It suggests civilizations or populations about which we know nothing or have been told nothing. Consider the physical requirements of destroying this evidence. The Montana remains allegedly filled multiple crates. Photographs existed. Witness statements were documented. Newspaper articles were published. To erase this from history required more than passive neglect. It demanded active suppression. Someone had to retrieve the specimens from public view, exclude them from catalogs, dismiss the photographic evidence as fraudulent, discredit the witnesses, and establish a professional consensus that such discoveries were impossible. Once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. The evidence cascade works like this. First, an isolated anomaly appears. Oversized skeletal remains discovered by credible witnesses. Second, the pattern multiplies. Similar discoveries across different states, different decades, different geological contexts. Third, the impossibility establishes itself. These findings contradict approved timelines and migration models. Fourth, suppression becomes visible. Institutional collection followed by evidentiary disappearance and narrative control. The Montana case fits this cascade perfectly. But it also introduces something additional: geological urgency. If these remains truly lay alongside Pleistocene fauna in undisturbed sediment, they represent chronological evidence, not just anatomical curiosity. Dating them would require acknowledging human presence in North America potentially tens of thousands of years earlier than currently accepted. That's not just inconvenient for one theory, it destabilizes the entire framework of American prehistory. Who benefits from suppressing this? academic institutions protecting their published theories. Museums avoiding displays that contradict established narratives. Anthropological associations maintaining professional consensus. And perhaps governmental authorities who prefer simplified historical accounts that don't raise uncomfortable questions about what else might be hidden. If you're wondering how deep this pattern goes, stay subscribed. We're about to examine how this same suppression mechanism appears in architectural anomalies, technological artifacts, and manuscript evidence, all pointing toward a civilization that shouldn't exist according to everything we've been taught. The Montana discovery wasn't just about size, it was about proportion. Dr. Hendricks' notes describe skulls with pronounced orbital ridges and cranial capacities suggesting advanced encephalization. These aren't descriptions of genetic anomalies or pathological gigantism. They're descriptions of anatomically distinct beings. Beings adapted for environments and purposes we can only speculate about. Beings whose existence challenges not just archaeology, but anthropology, evolutionary biology, and historical chronology. And they weren't isolated specimens. The Beartooth Mountain site contained multiple burials arranged in structured patterns. The Maiden Mineral article mentions evidence of intentional arrangement suggesting ceremonial significance. Multiple individuals deliberately interred with grave goods including metallic implements of unknown composition. This wasn't accidental death, it was a burial ground, a cemetery for a population. Where did that population go? What happened to the cultural continuity? Why don't modern Native American traditions extensively document these giants, despite oral histories describing tall ones or ancient predecessors? Some tribes do mention them. The Paiutes describe the Sea-Teka, red-haired giants who inhabited caves. The Comanche reference ancient tall people who preceded them. But these oral traditions have been systematically relegated to mythology rather than potential historical testimony. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Physical evidence appears, institutional authorities collect it, academic consensus dismisses it, the narrative simplifies, and researchers who persist in questioning face professional marginalization. What makes the Montana case different is its documentation trail. The newspaper articles exist. The physician's notes survive. The geological reports confirm Pleistocene context. The witness affidavits are archived. Everything except the actual remains. The most crucial evidence, the physical specimens themselves, disappeared into the Smithsonian's collection system and never emerged. This creates a critical evidential problem. Without the remains, skeptics can dismiss everything as misidentification or exaggeration. But dismissing it requires explaining why multiple credible witnesses independently described identical anatomical features. Why newspapers across different states reported similar findings. Why geological contexts consistently placed remains in impossibly old strata. Why institutional collection immediately preceded evidential disappearance. The skeptical explanation requires more coincidences than the suppression explanation. Think about what vanished from Montana. Skeletal remains measuring 9 to 11 feet. Cranial capacities 40% above modern averages. Anatomical proportions suggesting non-pathological gigantism. Geological context suggesting Pleistocene dating, cultural artifacts including metallic implements, photographic documentation, professional measurements, witness testimony. All of it gone, all of it collected by the institution responsible for preserving American anthropological evidence, all of it absent from their inventories. Here's the question that doesn't go away. If these specimens were fraudulent, why collect them? If they were misidentified, why not publish the correction? If they were genuine but explicable as genetic anomalies, why not display them?
The only explanation that fits the evidence is deliberate suppression of findings that contradict established narratives. And before you dismiss this as conspiracy thinking, remember, we are not speculating about secret meetings or shadowy organizations. We are observing documented institutional behavior. The Smithsonian collected anomalous specimens. This is recorded in newspapers. Those specimens aren't in their inventories. This is confirmed by their own FOIA responses. The gap between collection and preservation is the suppression. Everything else is just asking why. The Montana Giants force a choice. Either dozens of newspapers fabricated detailed, consistent reports across multiple decades, or evidence of anatomically distinct humans existed in North America during periods when conventional science says they couldn't. Either witnesses, physicians, and miners all hallucinated identical skeletal proportions, or institutions removed evidence that challenged approved timelines, which requires fewer assumptions. The implications expand beyond Montana. If the suppression explanation is correct, it suggests institutional archaeology operates with predetermined conclusions rather than following evidence. It suggests that findings contradicting those conclusions face systematic exclusion rather than scientific examination. It suggests the narrative of human origins and migration isn't built solely on discovered evidence, but on selected evidence, with inconvenient findings disappeared. This isn't about rejecting science. This is about demanding science follow its own principles. Examine all evidence, publish all findings, allow competing theories. When institutions collect evidence, then refuse to produce it, when peer review becomes gatekeeping, when narrative consistency matters more than evidential accuracy, we're no longer doing science. We're enforcing orthodoxy. The Montana case reveals the mechanism clearly because the documentation survived even though the evidence didn't. We can see the suppression happening. We can identify the institutional actors. We can trace the evidential disappearance. We can observe the narrative simplification. The pattern isn't hidden. It's right there in the historical record if you know what to look for. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So where does this leave us? With an 1889 discovery documented by newspapers, witnessed by miners, examined by a physician, collected by the Smithsonian, and erased from history. With physical evidence that could rewrite American prehistory locked away or destroyed. With institutions claiming such evidence never existed, despite documentary proof of collection. And with one question that refuses to disappear. What else have they buried? If you want to explore more cases where evidence contradicts official narratives, watch our investigation into the Old World architecture they claimed was built by primitive civilizations. The pattern continues, and it's time someone connected the dots.